Now, next Monday sees the 7th anniversary of the bombings of London's transport system that shook the United Kingdom to the core. Known as the 7/7 attacks, they raised in the public consciousness the prospect of homegrown British terrorism. At the moment, Western leaders are looking at how to grapple with the rising threat of the group Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. As in Britain, fears are growing that the terror that ISIS is wreaking across in Iraq and Syria might find its way back to these shores. Added into the mix are the investigations by Ofsted and the Department for Education, which has targeted 5 schools in Birmingham with largely Muslim pupils, placing them in special measures. We hear about the global jihadi threat. What about the British jihadi threat? How does the media deal with it? Is it exaggerated? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Miriam Francois Sarraj. She's a journalist and broadcaster. Also here in the studio is Rehana Patel, a journalist, writer and researcher who specialises in issues concerning Muslim communities, and Brooke Rogers, reader in Risk and Terror at King's College London. Many thanks for joining me. First of all, Miriam, just on the so-called Trojan horse plot, what has this done for the relations between, say, the Muslim community and the public at large?
I think it's had a very devastating impact on the community in Birmingham. If you speak to parents on the ground, it's clear that many of the children feel that they've been stigmatised by the media attention, and specifically by some of the headlines which have sought to link the schools to extremism. I've written about this in the New Statesman, and I've spoken to many people on the ground. It seems to me that instead of dealing with the fact that so many of the issues within those schools were to do with governance, were to do with the status of academies and free schools and the way that they operate with perhaps too much autonomy, some might argue, versus this idea that has been widespread in the press that it was something to do with sort of fundamentally extremist, radical views that were being propounded within the school. And I think that's the damage, really, is that rather than assessing the problem accurately and therefore dealing with it as an internal issue of governance to do with perhaps some overzealous governors, we're now discussing extremism, and that's not what this issue should be about.
And unusual, I suppose, that, say, children are being talked about it through the prism of national security. You're saying that the media have got it wrong, that the folk, and I guess that the expression Trojan horse has a certain kind of punch to it as well.
Well, certainly. The term Trojan horse, if we think about it, has been very widespread within the far-right discourse to refer to the Muslim community as this sort of implicit threat from within. So to have the same term that's used by the far-right regurgitated ad nauseum within the mainstream media uncritically is absolutely problematic. But moreover, the assessment of this issue has been problematic in that it hasn't been correctly viewed as an issue to do with governance and how academies and free schools function, and the fact that essentially this government has backed the autonomy of free schools, of academies, to define their own ethos, to define their own culture, in fact, to adjust their school days if they wish, in accordance with the needs of the local community. And when the community does that and happens to be Muslim, this somehow gets redefined as an issue of extremism. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying nothing has happened in these schools. I certainly do think that there have been some issues of concern. I think it's highly problematic that one of the speakers who was invited appears to have some very dubious views. And I certainly also think it's problematic that a school trip should implicitly exclude certain children by virtue of them not being Muslim. A school trip should be accessible to all children, absolutely. But do I think that this is somehow the reflection of an extremist plot to take off Birmingham schools? Absolutely not. I do think it is a reflection of a change in mood within the government, which is being pushed by Gove and others to really crack down on the Muslim community. And so that's more so the plot that I'm seeing, if you want to talk about a plot.
Rehana, do you see it as culturally insensitive? But do you think that this is a situation, and I'll use Trojan horse just as a shorthand, does it alienate the Muslim community, do you think?
No, definitely. And I live in Birmingham, and if you actually go into the schools and you talk to some of the teachers and the students, they're absolutely, they're disgusted by the fact that they're being targeted and singled out by this government political battle. The fact is, these schools were following the guidelines that were provided by Ofsted and by the government. They weren't doing anything wrong according to those guidelines. So why now, all of a sudden, is Ofsted coming out and saying there's extremism in the schools? The schools were rated some of the schools were rated as outstanding by Ofsted a few years ago. So there was no evidence of extremism, and they still haven't found any evidence of extremism. So it clearly is a political battle going on. They're trying to alienate Muslim schools. I mean, correct me, Mariam was right, there is a governance issue, but that shouldn't be put under an extremism or a radicalization framework.
I guess, Brooke, it goes to the heart of our fears that children are being indoctrinated in this kind of way, and the media kind of latch onto that.
I do believe that some of the criticism towards, again, the governance within schools is warranted, but I also believe that some of the criticism about the emotive language and the framing of the issue within schools is warranted. So people in glass houses should not cast stones. I think that this is more of a general issue that we've been struggling with in terms of defining and understanding the diversity of British identity. And when I was a young postdoc, I think back in 2002, we were working on a study called Parenting in Multiracial Britain, where we actually went around different areas of London from lower socioeconomic status to higher socioeconomic status schools. And we met with the schools and asked about how they were talking about identity and British principles and values. Then we went to the parents and asked how they were teaching their children about those issues. And then we spoke to the children as well. And even back then, we struggled to identify a British identity. We saw a lot of celebration of culture within schools, but it was almost as if everybody was afraid to really pinpoint what we meant by British identity, British values, and British principles.
Because the argument of so-called extremism or indoctrination is that it goes counter to what one would describe as British ideas and British principles.
It does, and when we define extremism in academia, we believe that these are political ideologies that are opposed to society's core constitutional values and principles. This isn't about religion. This is about citizenship and identity, and it is being made highly emotive when we talk about it only in religious terms. So I think that while the conversation has clearly had quite a negative impact on communities and a lot of the relationships between people across the board who try to engage with the diverse communities around England. I'm hoping that we might actually take a more positive step and actually say, look, this is an issue that we need to talk about and that we need to address, and we need to sit down and actually start really thinking, what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to have British values, and what does it mean to have British principles?
Who should be tackling extremism in the United Kingdom? Should it be something that mosques should be focusing on, or authorities?
If we're talking about the threat of violent extremism, that's definitely the government's remit. But does that mean that it shouldn't be working with communities? Of course not. There should be cooperation between communities, but cooperation suggests trust. And I think one of the core issues lacking here is trust between the police and the community, so that if you say to parents, you should be, telling us if your child goes off to Syria, and at the same time you're saying the people who will be in charge of monitoring this are going to be the security services, what you're saying is, if you tell us that your son's been off to Syria, we'll arrest him as soon as he lands. And you're putting parents in a real dilemma there, because there's a concern for their son, and I think it's a very genuine concern amongst many of the parents whose sons, we'll say predominantly sons, have who have gone off to Syria now. But there's also a concern, of course, that they should end up with the terrorist label for what might be, in some cases, a youthful mistake. And I think it's really important that we distinguish between two things here. There are people who will be going off to Syria out of a youthful exuberance and a belief that they're going off to fulfill some ideals. Do they potentially end up radicalized by extreme groups when they get there? Absolutely, and that is a risk that needs to be assessed. But we do need to make a distinction there, because there could be young people who go out there out of this desire to help Syrian people, who therefore I wouldn't qualify as extremist, but who then wish to return to this country. And what do we do with those? Are they also to be deemed terrorists?
But they will be painted as such, I suppose. I mean, if the call is, as you allude to, that mothers report their sons, I suppose, if they're going to go to Syria, from then on, they will be on record as being potential terrorists, won't they?
Correct, and I think that's where putting the onus on the community is highly problematic. And particularly, I mean, I've written about this as well, putting the onus on women within the community. We have our own issues as women within the community to deal with in terms of issues of authority, and to be undermined as a potential snitch, as it were. So to view women within the community as potential sources of betrayal is incredibly problematic. You cannot place that kind of responsibility upon women in the community. Apart from anything else, the evidence suggests that most parents had no idea that their children were going off to Syria. And to me is perhaps indicative of the government being more at a loss as to how to really tackle this issue. And so let's point the finger everywhere else except where perhaps it should lie, and that's with the government's having good sources of information, having good connections with the community so that it can acquire the kind of accurate information which would allow them to identify threats.
Rehana, we don't exactly know how many people are going to Syria and coming back radicalised, although there was the ICSR, which is King's College based, estimated something like 2,000 people from Western Europe, around 360 from the UK, but it does seem quite vague, doesn't it?
It is, and it's we don't know for sure. And I mean, the government's put the figure at 500 more recently, but that's still a very tiny minority. And what we should understand is that the motivations for young people going to Syria to fight are quite different from the motivations that we've seen homegrown terrorists like the 7/7 bombers actually go out. People that are going into Syria go there with a humanitarian angle, with a humanitarian cause to help the Syrian people. When they get there, they probably then become radicalized into going out and fighting. But the motivation is to help people. Whereas when you then look at the 7/7 bombers, for example, their motivations are quite different. It was more of an anti-Western agenda targeted mainly at British foreign policies.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing jihadism in Britain. With me in the studio is Dr. Brooke Rogers, reader in Risk and Terror at King's College London, Rehana Patel, who's a journalist, writer and researcher, and Miriam Francois Sarrar, a journalist and broadcaster. There would be a proportion of people who do go to Syria who are disenchanted with Western policy.
There may be, but I think the majority of people that go, they go there with the intention of helping the Syrian people or ending the suffering of the Syrian people, rather. I think let's go back for a little bit when we're talking about who should be responsible for tackling extremism. After the 7/7 bombings, the Blair government at that time invested quite a large, over 60 million, into a policy called Prevent. And although there are a lot of criticisms about Prevent, one of the successes of that was that there was a lot of community-based intervention programs targeting radicalization and empowering Muslim youth. Right now, what we're seeing with this new coalition government is that they're actually utilizing existing services such as healthcare, education, universities to tackle radicalization. And for example, NHS healthcare workers, they're asked to carry out a tick box exercises to identify potential radicalizers, as a matter of fact. And one of those is, a distrust of Western foreign policy. But what's been more successful is the community-led initiatives to counter radicalization. But saying that, how can communities address radicalization if the government only wants to engage with people who hold British values?
And on that point about Prevent, Brooke, I mean, radicalization is defined in the Prevent strategy as the process by which a person comes to support terrorism and forms of extremism leading to terrorism. It's quite broad and a bit of a one-size-fits-all answer to the problem. I mean, what do you think?
It's very difficult because it's not illegal to hold radical views. Radicalization is a process where we are trying to describe the changes in attitude that actually lead towards sanctioning and what we're worried about, ultimately involvement in the use of violence for a political aim. But just because you hold radical views doesn't mean that you're actually going to get to the point of wanting to engage in violence. And so we are not the thought police. Even as a psychologist, I could give out all the scales in the world, and it's very, very difficult to pinpoint where that change in attitude actually becomes more extreme or too extreme to the point of violence. We need to recognize that the pathways towards violence are different for every single individual. And when we're talking about numbers from 300 to 500 to, as you were saying, 2,000 across Europe, it is very, very difficult to actually understand who's just playing with these ideas, who is engaging with new ways of thinking and might actually be put off by these ways of thinking and move away from violence at some point. When we look at some of the individuals who go out, who think that they're going out for a greater cause, quite often they find that they don't fit in there either, and they can actually become even de-radicalized and want to come home. So it's a mixed bag. There are mixed pathways to violence. People who hold radical beliefs don't always move towards violence, and it's very difficult to discover when they are going to do so. I do think that we need to back up a little around this issue of who is responsible. And when we say the government, it's very, very difficult to pinpoint which area of government, because this is such a multi-agency issue. And I do think that we need a number of different agencies and communities and individuals to work together on this issue. And I also think that a lot of the conversations around prevent have just not been made very public. For example, I engage with local authority prevent coordinators. So when I talk to them or they talk to me about dealing with communities, they tell me about the diversity of communities and how they might be working with mothers on internet safety, let's say in Wandsworth. I don't know if they are in Wandsworth. I'm just giving that as an example. And a mile and a half down the road, they're working with a different type of community around different issues. All of these are linking to critical thinking skills and thinking about their children, or possibly thinking about citizenship and identity. But they're very different conversations with very different communities just a few miles apart.
What about preachers who preach hate? There's been some high-profile figures, Miriam, and should we expel them all? Should we, in the interest of free speech, allow them to say what they want to say?
Well, I think there are clear laws, thankfully, in place that say that if you incite hatred against people, then you will suffer consequences. So there are, we can't have this debate as if there are no laws already in place to protect us against some of the extremes of free speech. That said, given those boundaries, there should absolutely be a huge remit for people to express abhorrent views and for them to be debated and discussed and pulled apart. And I absolutely don't think that I can think of a historical example in which arguments are defeated by suppressing them. On the contrary, the sorts of arguments that we hear with these preachers within the Muslim community have very little traction. And the more open they are, the more easily people can say, actually, that's a load of rubbish, bring this guy along to a forum and let's put him up against some heavyweights, rather than creating almost martyr-like figures out of them who aren't allowed to express this so-called truth which they are desperately keen to get out there. No, I think we're much safer knowing what they're saying and being able to challenge them openly. Isn't
that the concern, though? I mean, people like Abu Hamza, Omar Bakri Muhammad, that if they are driven underground, they don't have their views tested by more moderate Muslims.
I would definitely say that was worse. I mean, if you look at Omar Bakri Muhammad, just as one example, obviously, who's now imprisoned in Lebanon. I mean, if we consider him being driven underground by him having left the UK, because he pretty much was, his views have become even more extreme since he's been in Lebanon, and the kind of traction he has is much harder to respond to because it's happening on internet forums most of the time. So it's happening in the sorts of environments where your average community leader might not be able to challenge them quite so openly. But I also think that there's an issue of consistency here. In other words, we allow extremists of a variety of garbs to express unpalatable views within our society, and we consider that to be a cornerstone, really, of a liberal democracy. In other words, it's an essential aspect of one of our key freedoms. And I think really the issue here is, why would we be targeting those views when it comes to one group rather than another?
So Muslims feel that they're under siege a bit? In that sense, they're not allowed to express the same kind of views. I can't speak
for Muslims, but I can certainly look at an inconsistency in the way that Muslim speakers who are radical are treated versus other radical speakers.
What about the Woolwich attacks, Rehanna? Unprecedented coverage. And I'm just wondering what you think the impact of those attacks had on relations between the Muslim community and society at large.
Well, we saw in the aftermath, we saw a wave of attacks on Muslim communities, on mosques, on houses. I know one individual was attacked, but a lot of Muslim organizations at the same time came out and denounced the attacks. My problem is there's no avenues out there within the Muslim community to actually challenge and discuss radicalization openly. When you go in, and I've spoken to a lot of mosques about this, and there's that fear of, if you start to open up a discussion on radicalization, you're going to be seen as extremists, because there will be people that will be coming in the mosque and talking about and actually expressing the views that it's okay to commit certain acts, that then that mosque would be labelled as extreme and not in line with British values. So if that discussion isn't there, that means we're not challenging, there's no avenues to challenge radicalizations appropriately.
And so do you think the media dealt with it fairly?
I think that we are learning as we go. And I do feel that some of the language has changed, especially since the 7/7 attacks. I was in one of the studios as it was unfolding, and I was listening to the very heated discussion about when they should call it terrorism or not. And we were watching the footage along with everyone else. And one of my key arguments was saying, when you actually start using that term, it has a number of different political ramifications, legal ramifications, and community ramifications. And I actually caught a bit of heat from a right-wing website for being the ever-cautious Dr. Rogers. And I will be cautious, and I do believe that a number of media organizations are learning to use the word terrorism more cautiously. I do think that some of the imagery that was played repeatedly was horrific, but I do think that media organizations need to think about the responsible use of that image and the impact that it can have in terms of being an emotive image. I was happier to hear some of the discussions coming out very quickly from different community groups saying this isn't about the Muslim community. And even as the attack was taking place, some of the citizens who stopped to help were saying, you can't frighten us and you're not going to get away with this, you aren't going to win, and basically pushing back and fighting back and saying this doesn't represent us as a whole.
Were you happy with the response? I mean, did you feel that Muslims were demonised after that particular attack?
I suppose it's very difficult when something as serious as what happened in Woolwich happens to not get caught up in the emotion of the act and to not link it to previous attacks on British soil. I suppose what I would have perhaps liked to have seen is a greater focus on some of the aspects of the individuals involved which link them to broader issues of criminality. So in this case, it wasn't a bomb being set off. It wasn't somebody trying to blow up an aircraft. It was an attack with knives and other instruments in broad daylight on an individual on a street. It was a stabbing by two young men on a London street. And of course, there was an ideological dimension to that. But I think there are also lots of other aspects to their background, which I think from a sort of criminological perspective were quite interesting and weren't really brought out in favour of almost an easy focus on the terrorist argument, when actually there should be a discussion of why these two individuals in particular were attracted to that sort of message and to this particular modus operandi.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing jihadism in Britain with Brooke Rogers, Rehana Patel and Miriam Francoise Sarah. Rehana, more broadly and internationally, the news this week that ISIS has declared a caliphate now. Does this have any kind of implications for the international community and Britain, do you think?
It's a very complex situation, and it's how you look at it. But what we're seeing is sectarian violence in Iraq. If it will spill over into Britain, it's still very debatable. We're not actually seeing British people going to fight with ISIS in Iraq, a large number of people. It's still a very tiny minority. And I think the mechanisms are in place for people to actually condemn the violence that's happening in Iraq. You know, we've seen it happening. A majority of Muslims are coming out on social media and saying, this is wrong, this is not Islam. And that's a huge step. It will have consequences politically, of course, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens next and what the British government's approach will be.
Do you think, Brooke, it will fuel Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's brand of jihadism that perhaps disenchanted, disaffected youths here, or they may be youths, whoever they are, might find some kind of solidarity in what he's espousing?
I'm watching this situation unfold with interest, and I do think it's a very dynamic situation at the moment. So I might be the cautious Dr. Rogers again on this and agree with Rihanna about this very strong voice coming out from the majority Muslim populations condemning this action. But I also think that there's an interesting dynamic taking place within Islamist groups where there's a fragmentation taking place. They're fighting for power. They disagree on certain aspects of how they should move towards the caliphate. I think that this could actually have the power overall to create a little bit of confusion and undermine some of the groups who have been gaining traction over quite an extended period of time.
Because declaring a caliphate, it's a big claim to make for yourself, isn't it? That's going to alienate Muslims.
I don't want to give al-Baghdadi's claim too much legitimacy. He's one, excuse the term, punk out in the desert claiming he's set up a caliphate. And what? Who is he to claim he set up a caliphate? I think there's a risk of overstating his claim to legitimacy and taking it more seriously than it deserves. There have been quite a few people in the history who have sought to set up their own little caliphates, not with much success, I should add. And so to that extent, what's perhaps more interesting to me on this issue is that why there's a focus on the notion of an Islamic State. And if we think about the region more broadly, we can think about the failure of political Islam through more institutionalized routes to find a means of establishing a type of Islamic State. In other words, the use of formal political avenues to establish a political system which reflects an Islamic ethos in line with the views of some of the political parties we've seen in the region. The failure to succeed through those routes, in my view, has to be linked to the radicalization of the views of certain individuals who now look at that and say, those routes are unsuccessful. We cannot go through formal political avenues. We cannot achieve this through democratic systems. We have to establish this through the gun. We saw this on a smaller scale, really, within individual states. When you saw the repression, for example, of the Ikhwan in Egypt, we saw more radical groups coming out of there. In fact, Zawahri is originally, he's Egyptian. He was from the Islamic Jihad and ends up saying, well, look, we can't work within Egypt. We need to go and fight the big Satan, as he would refer to it, the US. And so really the radicalization of perspective occurs when the avenues for institutionalizing certain visions of a state within the parameters of a given society are no longer available. We've seen the return of autocracy in Egypt. We've seen failed states in other areas. And I think, this idea of the Islamic State in Syria and the Levant has to be linked specifically to those issues.
So it's a disillusionment with Western imports of ideas of democracy.
I don't necessarily agree with the term Western imports. I would say that the idea is that there were certain openings within a number of societies which gave rise to hopes within various peoples in the region as to what their expectations could be in terms of their governments, in terms of governance in general. Those aspirations have been quashed by and large. Historically, if we look at Islamist movements and what happens to them when they are repressed, is that they do end up more radical in their outlook than when they're allowed to express those views through formal settings. My instinctive view on the whole brouhaha over the al-Baghdadi's claim is really to link it to the broader aspiration in the region for a state which reflects the mores, the ideals of the people. And unfortunately, those ideals have become radicalized amongst some.
And bringing it back to Britain, Rehana, say the actions of ISIS, do you think there will be some kind of critical discourse among Muslim communities here in the UK at these claims made by al-Baghdadi?
Oh, definitely. And we're already seeing that happening. Not even in Britain, internationally, I would say there's been a huge social media voice coming out saying that ISIS is not representative of the Muslim community. And I think that's an amazing progress. So it's a certain viewpoint, it's a vision, but that vision is not replicated anywhere else.
Brooke, I'll put you on the spot just for the final word. 7 years on from 7/7 as of next week. Are we safer? Non-Muslims, do they understand Muslims better? I mean, has there been progress in those 7 years?
I think sometimes we feel that we are more at risk, but purely because of the measures and information that we have available day in and day out through social media, through all of the different media channels. I don't actually believe that the risk has changed greatly. This is still a low likelihood but high impact risk that we're dealing with in the UK. In terms of the more general conversations and understandings of the Muslim community, I believe that there is a growing acknowledgement that this is a minority issue and that we need to be more responsible about the way in which we discuss this and frame it, because we actually can go too far and risk radicalizing people who were perfectly happy to go along as they were beforehand. So one, the risk I don't believe has changed greatly. Two, I do think that the general UK public is more aware of the impact of the conversations that we're having and the impact of the reaction that we might have to threats.
Well, many thanks. That's all we've got time for. That's Brooke Rogers, reader in Risk and Terror at King's College London. Rehana Patel, journalist, writer and researcher who specialises in issues concerning Muslim communities. And Miriam Francoise Sarrad, journalist and broadcaster. Thanks very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
Has been widespread in the press that it was something to do with sort of fundamentally extremist, radical views that were being propounded within the school. And I think that's the damage, really, is that rather than assessing the problem accurately and therefore dealing with it as an internal issue of governance to do with perhaps some overzealous governors, we're now discussing extremism, and that's not what this issue should be about.
And unusual, I suppose, that, say, children are being talked about it through the prism of national security. You're saying that the media have got it wrong, that the folk, and I guess that the expression Trojan horse has a certain kind of punch to it as well.
Well, certainly. I mean, the term Trojan horse, if we think about it, has been very widespread within the far-right discourse to refer to the Muslim community as this sort of implicit threat from within. So to have the same term that's used by the far-right regurgitated ad nauseum within the mainstream media uncritically is absolutely problematic. But moreover, the assessment of this issue, not. I do think it is a reflection of a change in mood within the government, which is being pushed by Gove and others to really crack down on the Muslim community. And so that's more so the plot that I'm seeing, if you want to talk about a plot.
Rehana, do you see it as culturally insensitive? But I mean, do you think that this is a situation, and I'll use Trojan horse just as a shorthand, does it alienate the Muslim community, do you think?
No, definitely. And I live in Birmingham, and if you actually go into the schools and you talk to some of the teachers and the students, they're absolutely, they're disgusted by the fact that they're being targeted and singled out by this government political battle. The fact is, these schools were following the guidelines that were provided by Ofsted and by the government. They weren't doing anything wrong according to those guidelines. So why now, all of a sudden, is Ofsted coming out and saying there's extremism in the schools? The schools were rated some of the schools, were rated as outstanding by Ofsted a few years ago. So there was no evidence of extremism, and they still haven't.
Has been problematic in that it hasn't been correctly viewed as an issue to do with governance and how academies and free schools function, and the fact that essentially this government has backed the autonomy of free schools, of academies, to define their own ethos, to define their own culture, in fact, to adjust their school days if they wish, in accordance with the needs of the local community. And when the community does that and happens to be Muslim, this somehow gets redefined as an issue of extremism. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying nothing has happened in these schools. I certainly do think that there have been some issues of concern. I think it's highly problematic that one of the speakers who was invited appears to have some very dubious views. And I certainly also think it's problematic that a school trip should implicitly exclude certain children by virtue of them not being Muslim. A school trip should be accessible to all children, absolutely. But do I think that this is somehow the reflection of an extremist plot to take off Birmingham schools? Absolutely.
Now, next Monday sees the 7th anniversary of the bombings of London's transport system that shook the United Kingdom to the core. Known as the 7/7 attacks, they raised in the public consciousness the prospect of homegrown British terrorism. At the moment, Western leaders are looking at how to grapple with the rising threat of the group Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. As in Britain, fears are growing that the terror that ISIS is wreaking across in Iraq and Syria might find its way back to these shores. Added into the mix are the investigations by Ofsted and the Department for Education, which has targeted 5 schools in Birmingham with largely Muslim pupils, placing them in special measures. We hear about the global jihadi threat. What about the British jihadi threat? How does the media deal with it? Is it exaggerated? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Miriam Francoise Sarrad. She's a journalist and broadcaster. Also here in the studio is Rehana Patel, a journalist, writer and researcher who specialises in issues concerning Muslim communities, and Brooke Rogers, reader in Risk and Terror at King's College London. Many thanks for joining me. First of all, Miriam, just on the so-called Trojan horse plot, what has this done for the relations between, say, the Muslim community and the public at large?
I think it's had a very devastating impact on the community in Birmingham. If you speak to parents on the ground, it's clear that many of the children feel that they've been stigmatised by the media attention, and specifically by some of the headlines which have sought to link the schools to extremism. I've written about this in the New Statesman, and I've spoken to many people on the ground. It seems to me that instead of dealing with the fact that so many of the issues within those schools were to do with governance, were to do with the status of academies and free schools and the way that they operate with perhaps too much autonomy, some might argue, versus this idea that